A look at the challenges both on and off the field as we discuss race power in sports next on Carpe Diem. Hello and welcome to Carpe Diem. I'm Marc Rosenweig, Associate Professor in the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State University. The issue of racism in sports and the power of the pro leagues and college athletic programs continues to make headlines. It's also part of our school-wide look at inequality issues. I explored these issues with 3 sports reporters in a panel discussion co-sponsored by the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center. The panel included Filip Bondy, sports columnist for New York Daily News, Mike Freeman, NFL national lead writer for Bleacher Report, and Clemson Smith Muniz, Spanish-language broadcaster for pro teams like the New York Knicks and Jets. I asked Mike Freeman how serious racial concerns are in sports.
It's as serious as it gets. We've always had sort of flare-ups in my career in every sport. You always have something comes up. But there's sort of a steady stream of stuff. Sterling was one. Some stuff in the NFL that I've seen is another. It's just what I've seen is just sort of a constant steadiness of it. And I think some of it is just awareness. There are more people of color covering this stuff now, and it's more important to some of us. So there's more awareness of it. But also, particularly in the NFL, anything the NFL does, and it's starting to be that way with the NBA, makes news now. So this stuff is pretty big, it's pretty important. It's just a lot of it. It's just steadiness. And I think that's the difference between now, at least in my experience, and in the past.
I think that the NFL can no longer just sort of whitewash this, no pun intended, this sort of stuff on its broadcasts, for example. It seems to always be staring us in the face, whether it's the use of the word Redskins. You're listening and you're wondering which broadcaster is going to use the word Washington and who's going to use the word Redskins, and you're listening very closely, things like that. And then, you know, you do have these other issues, these issues of domestic violence that are tagged to race to some degree that we have to sort through. So there are these things, as you're watching these broadcasts now, it is impossible not to think about race.
Clemson, what's your view of the situation?
I would argue that sports has always been a microcosm of a society, and these flare-ups are reflecting the tension that we're having in our supposedly post-racial society. Yeah. I think things are just as bad in the general market, general public, general circumstances, but we're not dealing with it because we're having a hard time talking about race as a society. And it's flaring up in sports, which has and many times been the medium, the catalyst to evoke or start change, racial change. It's an interesting confluence, but I think it's related to what's happening in society, the fact that we have a black president, the fact that we have economic issues, the fact that we don't talk about race openly at any level, politically, socially, culturally, and it's now coming out in sports.
That's a really good point about we don't talk race. I mean, we're doing it now, so we do to some extent, but we don't really talk extensively about it. It scares a lot of people. It angers a lot of people. I mean, message boards are the sewer system of the internet, so they're not representative of society. But if you look at any story that deals with race and you look at what people write at the end of it, at message boards, they just, all the time they just say, why are you always talking about race? Like, I get that all the time. And I don't talk about race enough. I should talk about it a lot more. And I get all the time, you talk too much about race. I'll write one story a year about race and I'll get, you talk too much about race. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really good point. And it would just be a lot better if we had more conversations like this, and we don't. We, as a society in general, we're scared to have conversations like this.
Do you think that there's more, I mean, you touched on it in your first answer, that there's more awareness today. Was that because of the technology? Is that a good thing? I mean, one of the things that I've noticed is, like on the local news, for example, we're seeing, particularly here in New York, we're seeing a lot of cell phone video of police, you know, attacking minority citizens and so on. But then the question is always raised, well, what happened before the video rolled, and so on and so forth, and you have this unrest in a major city.
Well, Philip brought up a good point about the Washington team nickname, and this is a good example of how some of this stuff is starting to work now. You know, Phil Simms, broadcaster, former Giant quarterback, white guy, everyone was talking about whether or not he's going to use the nickname. And that is something that, I don't know, not even 5 years ago would have been a conversation. And it's because of, I think in part, the technology raises the awareness. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, this is an issue that's been talked about a lot. It's forced the networks in a lot of ways to deal with it. This nickname has been an issue for a long time, but all the technology has bubbled it to the surface. And now it forces a network like CBS and Phil Simms to deal with it and talk about it. And that's part of the issue here too, which is a good thing to me. Phil Simms is one of the big names in sports, and he's being asked if he's going to talk about this nickname, which is offensive to a lot of people. That's good, I like that. So in some ways, a lot of the technology is very positive.
And we should tell our viewers and our students that he's not using the nickname, correct?
That's
he's
right.
chosen not to.
What's
your view of that?
Well, my view is that a society or a nation cannot commit genocide on a whole peoples and then turn them into mascots and nicknames. It can't be done. It's as if you had a team in Germany called the Hamburg Rabbis, right? And then they went around and danced the hora or whatever. You can't do that.
Don't give the Germans any ideas.
You can't do that. It's absurd. There's no argument that I can think of in favor of it, and it's been going on for so long, as has Chief Wahoo, the Cleveland Indian mascot, which is another absurdity. If you are offending a sizable minority of people with this sort of thing, there is no excuse for continuing it. I mean, and as I said, you know, white America committed genocide on Native Americans, and now you cannot suddenly turn them into, not suddenly, but you can't turn them into mascots. It's absurd and ridiculous.
And there also seem to be different standards because I think in, North Dakota, they no longer allow them to call themselves the Fighting Sioux, but then at Florida State, we have the Seminoles. So,
well, there are different regions where certain tribes agree with the notion of having them as their mascots or whatever, but it's a very dicey situation. And the argument that these nicknames are cast in cement and cannot be changed, that's ridiculous too. I mean, St. John's changed very easily to Red Storm, and I don't think too many of the younger students care in the least bit about that anymore.
Well, when I went to Ohio our rivals, Miami University of Ohio, they were the Redskins, and now they're the Red Hawks, just like Montclair State. So
yeah, if you change the name, it's not that big. I mean, I grew up a hardcore fan of that Washington team, and everyone in my family, and I was completely unaware that the nickname was offensive growing up as a kid. And then when I became older, you study up on it, you learn it's a horrible thing. So you can change your views, and my family's they're hardcore fans of that team. If you change the name, they wouldn't care. No one would really care. It's all stew. It's a red herring. It doesn't make any sense. And you could easily change the name, and most fans would be like, okay, we'll just root for this team now.
what was the watershed event when you learned that this was offensive to people? Because you said you grew up with it, so it wasn't on your radar.
I think it was just learning about it and reading up on it extensively, and the history of American Indians, and I'm part American Indian. So it was a lot of that stuff, a lot of just sort of growing up, self-realization, learning, reading, and you realize it's just it's just bigotry, and the funniest part is just the honoring part. I mean, how are you honoring someone doing that? It makes no sense. But that's what the owner of that team, Dan Snyder, I've done so many stories on this. He is not changing. He's sticking to it. I think he really wants to get a Super Bowl out of it, and once he gets a Super Bowl out of it, he might change. But it's all about money and stubbornness.
Can the commissioner do anything about that? I always wondered.
The commissioner could, but the commissioner doesn't want to.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I mean, I've been on
has many issues, and I think there was a meeting yesterday in which he was catching heat from the owners, according to published reports today. So that climate is kind of in
I don't know if
turmoil.
nickname is on the top of his agenda right now, but I always get on the case of, well, now Rob Manfred about allowing that Chief Wahoo, which I would think the commissioner's office could just say, you know what, no more. You know, that's it. We'll pay you a little bit compensation for licensing fees, but take Chief Wahoo off the table.
And we should tell everybody that Rob Manfred is going to become the next commissioner of baseball when Bud Selig retires, right? Just so everybody knows. Clemson, do you think enough sports reporters are paying attention and writing about these issues, or are too many of them wanting to ignore it unless they have no other choice, that it's such a big headline?
I think we're all being forced to address it, whether you like it or not. You have to distinguish between the beat writers, people who cover a team on a daily basis, and they're worried more about, in baseball, for example, who's pitching today, who's in a slump, what's the manager going to do, and particularly if you're in a competitive market like New York, where you're worried about what is the other paper going to publish. It doesn't absolve them from having a social conscience or seeing the world in a bigger context, but you have to, they're different, they're beat writers or columnists or commentators. Now you do TV. They're people like Mike Wilbon who work in both worlds, so you have different platforms. Bill Simons at Grantland is TV and it's internet and it's print. So some of us can have the platforms or the medium to express their views if we want it. And I think it's part of it is the view, the old-fashioned view that sports is escape, it's games.
Yeah.
But I mean, I go back to my point that sports is a microcosm of society. Because of sports, we maybe happen to integrate this country faster and less violently than without sports. When Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier and people started seeing that locker rooms could coexist with black and white men and later Latino men, and they could work together to win championships. But I guess it goes to the top. It's not only reporters, but who are the bosses? Who are the editors? Who are the producers? Who are the people making the decision on what's important? And an interesting phenomena of the Ray Rice case, particularly once we saw the video of him punching his wife in the elevator, was how many women became part of that conversation on television. Important women who had covered sports for a while but weren't given the platform, the time, the voice.
Right, people like Hannah Storm and Rachel Nichols and so on.
Yes, and another interesting thing was how long that story had legs. Like it wasn't for a week and then we went on to something. It's still there, it's lingering, partly because Ray Rice is appealing his suspension and the league is trying to figure out how to deal with the domestic violence. But it goes back to my point. Domestic violence is not a NFL issue, a sports issue. It's a society issue. And all of us have been blind to it or ignored it or haven't given it the importance. And maybe sports will again be the catalyst to force change in society. But it's going to be a slow, messy process because you got owners who are interested in making money, fans who just want their games and their diversion escape, and then sports writers saying, wait a minute, am I a sports writer, political writer, social writer, am I a shrink? I mean, how do I deal with this? Not everybody's a Filip Bondy or Mike Freeman.
That's very nice of you to say that. Philip, though, what about the demands put on sports writers today with the smaller staffs, fewer editors, having to tweet and file many times a day for the website? Does that mean that there is legitimately less time to dive into these complex issues, or is that just an excuse?
That's an excuse. I think, speaking for the dying media that I am of print, I think that a good section still can be and still must be a balanced section. You still have the space and the resources. They may be more limited, and maybe you can't afford to send as many people on as many lengthy pieces as you once could, but you still have the ability as an editor to balance your section. You can have game analysis, you can have humor, you can have issues, and you can have them all, and should have them all on a daily basis. I think, where newspapers fail is when they become too narrow and when they just do game coverage, and some have been guilty of that in the past, sure.
Mm-hmm. Mike, you wrote a book about ESPN and had some probing things in there, and there have been other examinations of ESPN. And is that part of the issue too, that we have a lot of media companies, but particularly them who have dual interests? They have news operations, and then on the other side of the fence, they have tremendous business relationships with the NFL and Major League Baseball and all these other leagues.
Well, that's a great point, and the answer is yeah, because you didn't see it as much with Ray Rice, maybe a little bit, but you've seen it in other instances where a company has the conflict of interest really tight with the NFL, and the NFL has a lot of say, and the NFL will express themselves. So you'll see a backing off sometimes. I've seen that, but if you're good at what you do and you're passionate about it, and you just move forward and you ignore it. I've gotten those calls from the NFL where they say, "Why'd you write that?" And
what do you say?
I say, "That's what I wanted to write. Sorry." And I say, "I'm fair," and that most of the time, and most of the time I am fair. But you will get those calls, and you will get that pressure, and you do see with some of the larger companies like in ESPN, they fight that all the time. They fight that dual interest all the time, where the NFL says, "We don't want you to do a series, or we don't want you to do this," and they have to fight that. And most of the time they do, but they do have that push to not do things.
Should the audience be less trustful of them at this point?
I think they have pulled off, there's some criticism of them, and some of it's valid, but they've pulled off a tough spot to me. And they pulled it off, actually, in many cases pretty well. They have some really good investigative reporters that, on the right stuff in particular, did some really good stuff. And they've done some good stuff, but they do, at times, compromise themselves. So I wouldn't say, every reader should always be, read with great skepticism of everything. Like, that's always been my approach. When I read something, I read it just saying, okay, that's one viewpoint, what's the other viewpoint? A reader should always have that way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. We touched on, earlier briefly on social media, and I want to circle back to that for a minute because, Clemson, what's your view of the impact of social media on coverage of racism and other hot-button issues in sports, and as you say, in society in general? I mean, it can inflame the situation, but it can also inform. What are the trade-offs here?
Before I answer that question, it's made, in my business as a play-by-play announcer, it's made the audience think they're smarter than I am and know more.
Yeah.
So they're tweeting you during the game? Is that what they're doing?
They may, no, I mean, it's changed our business. I mean, people now know more. And so the role of a broadcaster, more in TV, I think, because you got the graphics, you got the ability to use graphics information, less so on radio where people are still depending, you're painting the picture and you have to describe things. But the flow of information makes it, you got to realize that your audience is now more informed and it's your challenge and your duty is to put it in context and there's a lot of information, but it's that, what does it mean? And you know, when do we become sabermetrics diehards and say Puig should not have played because he had struck out 8 times in the series, and when you use common sense, say, yeah, but he's the best player and he can bust a home run and win the game. So you get those challenges. But going back, social media has impacted all sorts of on all sorts of level, and it's increased awareness, it's increased information, it's in many cases expanded dialogue. But like Mike pointed out, it's also allowed for a lot of hatred to seep into the conversation. And it's hard sometimes to have a rational or honest debate or dialogue over issues because people immediately go into a defense mechanism and start spouting. They just get angry, they get profane, they get racist, and it's easy to do because you're anonymous in many cases.
And no consequences.
And very little consequence.
Yeah, I mean, I used to get hate email. I don't get hate email anymore. I get hate tweets, right? That's one thing that's changed. Whether that matters or not, I don't know. But I mean, the tweets can be. I mean, you know, one of the examples is some of the awful stuff you see on Twitter when a black hockey player is playing.
You wrote about this.
Yeah, I mean, we had examples of that, really bad, really nasty, awful examples of that last spring during the Stanley Cup playoffs, where, you know, and hockey remains a very delicate, fragile sport, racially speaking. I mean, there's no hiding the fact that when you walk into Madison Square Garden to cover the Rangers, I can count on 2 hands the number of people of color sitting in the stands. And that's just the way it is. And I feel for there's like, you know, the few black players that are in the league face all kinds of stuff. And the hatred on Twitter is just astounding. It really is. It harkens to the European soccer leagues. It really does.
Well, if you think about it, you used to, when people wanted to express their hatred, they used to write a letter, right? So they'd sit down and start to write a letter, and then they kind of cool down, and then maybe throw the letter away, or whatever. And now, when you want to really express your hatred, it's right there. There's just a keyboard, and you can just say whatever you want. And you can do it anonymously, and there's no repercussions, most of the time. But a really good point you made about everyone thinks they know more, because in football you see that now because they've made the game film available to basically every fan. So now every fan thinks they're Bill Parcells. And because they can watch film, they think they know everything, more than even the players, more than the coaches. And you're now also starting to see the sabermetrics sort of creep into football a lot more. So now there's another element of know-it-allism. So now it's just gotten completely crazy where people think football, to me, which can be an immensely complicated sport, cannot be boiled down to numbers and other things because of the violence of the sport. People ignore that, and there's no context. And that's one of the things that social media, to me, has really kind of hurt, is there's not a lot of context to almost anything. There's just reaction and vitriol. It's not always like that. There are good parts to it, but there's more that than anything else to me.
Don't we also have that with some bloggers who don't have journalistic credentials, don't have contacts, and are, you know, sitting in their basement blogging and maybe spewing out misinformation and hatred as well?
But I mean, I'm not, as a media person, I'm not opposed to bloggers. I mean, I think of Thomas Paine. I argue Thomas Paine was the first American blogger.
A lot of people thought he was irresponsible at times.
Yes, but and that's part of an open democratic society. We have to. The challenge is learning how to filter or understand what is relevant and what isn't, and that's the hard thing with so much out there. I agree, but I'm less bothered by bloggers. I mean, people sit in a basement or living room and start writing about a team. some of them know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
You don't always have to agree with them, but that's the beauty about sports. I mean, who do I start? Who do I sit? Is it Geno Smith today or is it Michael Vick?
Hopefully neither, but I'm speaking like a long, frustrated Jets fan.
As access to the mainstream media continues to decrease, which it has, it empowers bloggers, doesn't it? Because we don't really have that much more access than they do in some occasions. In some occasions. The NFL prepackages itself so carefully, and most of their interviews are available on one outlet or another anyway. So you find, unfortunately, that you are competing in many ways with these bloggers in terms of what information you have access to. I mean,
or the team websites even.
Yeah, the team websites is another example, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
so, what do we have exclusively anymore, right? You really, really have to work at it to get exclusive material. So in that regard, they've taken away our chief weapon of information and news, haven't they, these leagues?
Wasn't that part of the problem, that whether it's the issue of racism or any other important issue, that these teams and these leagues are trying every day to control the message, and many times some of them have employed former journalists to work on their websites and so on. How big an issue is that?
That hasn't worked out so well in a
that
lot
right?
of cases. And I will say this about sort of the mainstream media. You saw with the Ray Rice case how the mainstream media still has a lot of power, and how sports leagues still have a hard time at times controlling the message, because the NFL completely bungled every aspect of that from start to finish and lost control of everything. And the media was, mainstream media, some really good reporting by some ESPN people. We talked about some of the women before who did some really good reporting, but in general, really good reporting, really good columns out of that. And the NFL had no power to kind of stop it. It was this big snowball that just kept rolling down the hill because they kept screwing up. And then you had mainstream media with a lot of power and a lot of clout. So we still have the ability to be, in a lot of cases, independent and strong and do some good reporting. There's a lot of great reporting out of all that. And the leagues sometimes are not as powerful as we sometimes make them to be.
In our next program, we'll continue our look at race power in sports as we discuss the impact of websites and the rest of the current media landscape on coverage of these issues. Thanks to our panelists, and special thanks to Dave Kaplan, the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center, for co-sponsoring the panel. For more information on this or any edition of Carpe Diem, contact us at carpediem@mail.montclair.edu or call 973-655-5158. I'm Marc Rosenweig from all of us at Montclair State University. Thanks for watching Carpe Diem.